Hello, and thank you all for joining us for today's virtual community briefing of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute's new report titled From Disparity to Parity, Latino Representation in Appointed Positions Within California's Gubernatorial Cabinet and State Boards and Commissions. We'd like to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors for today's webinar, California State Senator Monique Limon, who you'll be hearing from shortly, Hispanos Organized for Political Equality, and the California Latino Legislative Caucus. My name is Paul Barragan-Monge, and I serve as the Director of Mobilization at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Gabby Carmona, who is our lead policy analyst, and will be providing an overview of our report and key findings. So just by way of introduction, UCLA LPPI is a multi-issue public policy think tank whose research focuses on the civic participation and the democratic inclusion of the nation's diverse and growing Latino communities. We at LPPI believe fundamentally that every single issue is a Latino issue, be it health access, the right to a quality education, criminal justice reform, or as we'll be discussing here today, representation in government decision-making. So today we'll be overviewing a first of its kind analysis that provides a comprehensive look into the demographic characteristics of over 400 executive appointments to California state boards and commissions. But before we jump into the report, I'd like to welcome two of our co-sponsors, Senator Monique Limon and Diana Amaya from HOPE, to share some brief opening remarks. So Senator Monique Limon was elected to the Senate in November of 2020 and represents the 19th district in the Senate within California. This includes everything from Santa Barbara County, as well as over half of Ventura County. Born and raised in the 19th district, Senator Limon has worked continuously to serve a community as an educator, a leader, and an advocate for causes advancing quality of life in her community. Prior to joining the Senate, Senator Limon served 4 years in the State Assembly, where she chaired the Banking and Finance Committee and was vice chair of the Legislative Women's Caucus. In the legislature, she's been a lead champion for legislative solutions to improve transparency in our state appointments process. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing her as a former student of hers at UC Santa Barbara during my time with the McNair Scholars Program. Senator Limon.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I will say that one of my highlights in my entire career is being able to connect with students who I had the chance to work with who are now doing amazing things. And Paul is one of them. So this is really one of my career highlights, being able to connect with students. And today, especially on an issue related to the one we're going to discuss today, which is appointments, right? In the state of California, gubernatorial appointments at a level in California that's really important. I am the first woman and person of color to be elected to the Senate from Santa Barbara and Ventura County. So I am the first person of color from my district, which I was born and raised in and that I dearly love and connect. And that's influenced a lot of the ways that I think about some of these positions in leadership. I oftentimes find myself being the only one, the single one of a few in very, many different spaces. And so when I got to thinking about this work and how we ensure that in California, we have voices that reflect so many different communities at the table, I got to thinking a lot about what it means to have appointments reflect the community that we live in and appointments that reflect the state of California. And working alongside with HOPE, we decided to partner. This is our second year partnering on this effort to move forward Senate Bill 1387. Senate Bill 1387 requires that the state, specifically the governor's office, put out a report so that we have access to real-time data about what our appointments look like in the state of California. I've always believed that it's that information, that data that can help guide us so that we see what the best practices are, where they're happening, but also where we could apply some of those best practices in areas where that might not be happening. I'm certainly a believer that the more folks we have that look like California, that represent California, the more encompassing policies that we can create and advance. I think we've seen in the last last few years with Governor Newsom, a great improvement on some of our numbers. And the UCLA report certainly highlights that. And I'm so thankful that now we're not just going from a concept or your theory that's out there in a silo to now a concept and theory that's backed by evidence by the UCLA report. And so we are hoping that we're able to move this across the finish line. And this is an important place because you see the intersection of policy connected to research. You don't always see that in the work that I do. I've been in the legislature 6 years, and that's not always the case. But here you certainly have evidence-based policy that we're trying to advance, and policy that was vetoed last year that has the potential of being vetoed again. But I think it's really, really important to be able to advance this. I also think it's important not simply because we want to see faces that reflect all of our community, but because we want those spaces to be able to bring real policy solutions. I oftentimes find that there's certain parts of our state that are well represented on boards and commissions, and that includes Sacramento and the Bay Area, and to some extent, some parts of LA, but there's 58 counties in this state. And oftentimes as a representative of the Central Coast, I realize there's not a lot of us at the table that just have a different experience based on where we live, geography, transportation, water issues, energy issues. They're all slightly different because of where we live and what we're able to connect to or not connect to because of the population size. And we think about these policies differently. So that is exactly why I believe that boards and commissions in the state of California should have that reflection and should include not just race, ethnicity, but geography and all types of backgrounds that help us make better informed decision and advise our state agencies in such a way. So Senate Bill 1387 is on the governor's desk. It has gotten out of the legislature. And really, as you hear today's presentation, my ask to you is to make sure that if this is a bill that speaks to an importance that is, ideal in your life, in your work life, in your professional life, that if this is something that you believe in, that you please write the governor's office to support this bill. It needs all the help it can get, specifically because it got vetoed last year. And so we want to make sure that our governor's office knows that there's great support for this and that we're really trying to figure out how to move best practices forward. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, to UCLA Latino Policy Research Center for allowing us this opportunity and for also ensuring that we intersect policy with research because we believe that makes the strongest work and policy for the state of California. So thank you all.
Thank you again so much for being here, Senator. And we'll have a Q&A portion for our audience at the end where we'll invite questions for the Senator as well as the other featured speakers today. So next up, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Diana Amaya. Diana is the Director of Programs for Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, HOPE. Diana has been with the organization for 10 years, working on policy and directly training Latinas aged 16 and over for leadership, both in and out of the workplace. Currently, she oversees the implementation of the organization's 4 flagship leadership development programs and the creation of new training initiatives. Diana.
Thanks so much, Paul and LPPI for the invitation and to be a part of this community briefing. It's a topic that we love to talk about. We're really excited about the impact of your report and, of course, the potential for SB 1387. This bill is a continuation of HOPE's work over the last 20 years in ensuring that California's governing bodies are reflective of California and the people that live here. And of course, the Latinos are a part of the decision-making table when it comes to state dollars, natural resources, education, and all of the other issues and decisions that the governing bodies make. HOPE's been in the leadership and advocacy space for over 30 years. Training the public about the public and our Leadership Institute and our leadership program participants on the importance of serving on boards and commissions. And we've built through Leadership Institute an amazing network of Latina leaders with a variety of different expertise and skill sets that are ready and willing to serve on state boards and commissions. And we've put forward nominations in the past, and we've built relationships with different appointing bodies that have allowed us to nominate Latinas. And certainly at Hope and other organizations in this current administration, as the senator alluded to, have been working with this governor to appoint more Latinas. That's why we've seen an uptick in appointments of Latinos. But it's always been a big challenge to measure success and to see how many people of color, how many women, Latinas, LGBTQ folks are serving on boards and commissions. And so LPPI was instrumental in us pursuing this particular bill and this idea. The research that you all have been doing and the fact that you guys actually flagged the Illinois Gubernatorial Boards and Commissions Act for Hope was really a big game changer for us, and it was a no-brainer for us to run with it. We were very lucky to find a partner in Senator Limon who believes in this work and who believes as much as Hope does in equitable representation. And so Hope continues to be committed to ensuring that California's governing bodies are representative of our rich diversity. It's important to note that research has shown that diversity in government leads to policies that better reflect the interests of the people. And that's incredibly important in a state as populous as the state of California. We are currently mobilizing our base to support this bill and to make sure that the governor signs it, hopefully, fingers crossed. And I'll share a link a little later on where people can engage and stay, hold the governor to signing this bill.
Thank you so much to you, Diana, to Hope, to Helen Torres, whose collective leadership has really made this a front and center issue that the administration has begun to take seriously. And we look forward to continuing to partner with you and Senator Limon in championing this legislative effort and others to come. So I'll call on my colleague Abby to just open up the deck real quick. And we can go ahead and get started with a brief overview. So why a focus on appointments? LPPI decided to take an in-depth look on the state of Latino representation across cabinet leadership and influential state boards and commissions, in large part because community members, like many of you here on the webinar today, highlighted this as a major gap in our understanding of Latino political power in state government. For many years, we've known that Latinos have been grossly underrepresented across state decision-making bodies, but our knowledge of these disparities has been largely anecdotal. So with this data, we now are finally able to quantify these historical disparities in concrete terms that we believe can help instigate policy action at the state level. As you know, appointed positions in state boards and commissions, as well as departments, are extremely influential. These positions play a critical role in establishing statewide policy priorities, regulatory standards, and determining the allocation of billions of dollars in state and federal funding. So this report examines the extent to which Latinos, who are the largest racial and ethnic group in California, are included in these consequential decision-making roles. So to offer some background on the scope of appointments, California's executive branch consists of more than 3,000 appointments. With every commission has a very specific scope of authority and policy focus, but at minimum, the people serving on these bodies are constitutionally bound to represent the diverse interests and experiences of California's large multiracial democracy. We know that decades of research has demonstrated that when leaders of governing institutions look like the communities that they serve, this ultimately improves trust amongst residents and the belief that these institutions are fair. So diverse representation is really critical to maintaining not only the credibility, but also the integrity of our governing institutions. This particular report, as you'll see on this slide, analyzes the demographic representation of key positions across California's executive branch, consisting of 482 appointees within the governor's leadership cabinet and in executive boards and commissions. This, as you'll see, includes 25 secretaries and undersecretaries within the governor's leadership cabinet, who together head California's 11 major departments and agencies. It also includes 45 executive boards and commissions that operate within the state's major departments and agencies and cover everything from professional licensing to environmental protection to public safety and K-12 educational standards. So with that overview, I'd love to invite my colleague Gabby, who will now guide us through the report methodology and some of the key findings. Gabby.
Thank you, Paul. So jumping into our methods before I briefly summarize some of our top findings, I just wanted to outline that for all 400 plus executive appointments that we identified, we collected some basic information about the appointee and their appointment. So for the appointee, this included gender, race, and ethnicity. This here is defined by the US Census. Educational attainment, so their alma mater and educational degree, and then the place of residence at the time of their appointment. And then for the appointment itself, we collected some basic information about the appointment position, the appointment date made, who appointed them, as well as whether they had any reappointments. And all of this information was identified through two different types of publicly available sources. One is self-identification, so straight to the source, biographies, resumes, and LinkedIn profiles. And then the second was reputable public sources such as news features, the governor's own announcement and press release about the appointment, awards or organizational affiliations. And then that last source on the bottom is really only applicable to identifying race and ethnicity, but if that wasn't immediately available from public sources that I listed above, we relied on the US Census's surname analysis, which provides us with a racial probability of the most common surnames in the US. And ultimately, if no source met our threshold for identifying race and ethnicity in particular, that individual was marked as unknown, and that encompasses about 14% of all of our appointments. And a quick note here before I go into the findings is just that for the purpose of this analysis, we had to mark an endpoint. So all of the data and all of the appointments that we looked at reflect the appointments that had been made up to March 15th of 2022. So digging into our data, we've broken down our results into several key findings. The first is that Latinos have the largest representational gap among all racial and ethnic groups in California's executive appointees, ultimately meaning that the share of appointees that are Latino doesn't approximate their share of the state's population. Table 1 here breaks down what I mean by that. It analyzes the seated appointments that we looked at in this report, the vacancies, the total number of appointees that are Latino and Latina, and how we should consider this number within the context of proportional representation. Across the executive branch, we analyzed a total of 445 active appointments and identified 37 vacancies. Given our benchmark for proportional representation, we know that this is an underrepresentation of 20.7 percentage points. As 39.1% of the population, Latinos should make up at least 174 out of the 445 appointments that we looked at, which means that 92 more Latinos should be added to the governor's cabinet and executive boards and commissions. And when I say 92 more Latinos, I'm encompassing of both Latinos and Latinas, because as you'll see, Latinas in particular are severely underrepresented in these decision-making tables, as only 39 of all appointees. So for finding 2, in fact, we focused in on Latina and gender. In comparison to all their female peers, Latinas see some of the highest rates of underrepresentation across all executive appointments. In comparing the total race and ethnic breakdown of California women to their representation in executive appointments, cabinet appointments, and boards and commissions, we see that Latinas remain the most underrepresented, making up 19.4% of the state's population, yet only 8.5% of all appointments. The representation is smallest in the governor's cabinet, which is where female representation is actually largest at 60%. But those shares are mostly driven by the overrepresentation of non-Hispanic white women, who make up 18.3% of the state's population, but 28% of the governor's cabinet. And in exploring some of these representational disparities across race and gender, we also explored how Latina and Latino underrepresentation had larger implications for other key perspectives that are missing on these boards, commissions, and executive branch appointments. So this brings us to finding 3, because our diverse state of California, which in many ways is its own country with differing economic drivers and industries, but also unique populations from various socioeconomic standings and cultural backgrounds, isn't geographically represented in our appointments. When we look into geographic representation, to do so, we actually divided California into 7 major areas that are listed here on this graph. In the appendix in the report provides kind of an outline of what counties are encompassed within each of these regions. It outlines, basically this graph shows us that within these regions, the share of the Latino population, the share of the total population, and the share of appointees that are currently residing in each of these regions. And we found that the lack of Latino representation was reflective of a larger underrepresentation of Central and Southern Californian. In particular, Central and Southern California encompasses over 71% of the state's residents, more than 83% of our Latino community, but less than 50% of all the boards and commissioners are currently residing or representing these diverse regions. Ultimately, the worst representation is really in the Inland Empire, and some of the greatest representation is in the Bay Area and the Greater Sacramento region, which might be likely due to just proximity to the state capital and other networks that often are affiliated with getting into some of these boards and commissions. So this brings us to finding 4, because ultimately we're spotlighting demographic under and overrepresentation across all of these appointments, not necessarily to point fingers or single out groups, but really to spotlight how the lack of proportion of these bodies has downstream implications for policy decision making. Because the absence of Latinos on these boards and commissions ultimately means that 39.1% of the state's population don't have an adequate voice in tables and in tables that regulate the education, the environment, economic opportunity, criminal justice, and more. For the purpose of this analysis, we were able to group the 45 boards and commissions that we're tracking into 4 key topic areas. So broadly, we found that Latinos are best represented in boards and commissions that oversee education at 27.7%. This, of course, is an incredibly important topic for Latinos, who make up over 55% of California's K-12 public schools and 43% of its state-funded higher educational student body. The caveat here is that 5 out of the 23 educational appointees who are Latino are actually student members, so they don't have the same leadership responsibilities, tend not to be able to vote, at least for their first year, and then have shorter terms in general. And then by contrast, the lowest representation of Latinos is in our criminal justice boards and commissions. This is actually also our smallest category of boards and commissions. Among these appointees, only 10.3% are Latinos. That's 3 out of 29, which is troubling given the existing disparities in how Latinos are impacted by the criminal justice system and whether their stories or voices are even considered when it comes to criminal justice reform work. And lastly, we identified these gaps in representation. As we identified these gaps in representation, it was important to us to explore some of the underlying mechanisms, like term limits and reappointments that might be perpetuating these inequities, but also the progress that has been made thus far in improving representation. In a testament to the progress that has been made by Governor Newsom and his appointment secretary, our data suggests that the biggest gains in Latino representation in executive appointments has come over the last 4 years under the Newsom administration. The chart here outlines the initial appointment date, or in other words, the date that appointees were first appointed to their positions. We see that from 2019 to 2022, 70.7% of the current appointments that we looked at were made, of Latino appointments specifically, were made. But as you'll notice, there's also a great deal of appointments who have been seated in these appointments for more than 4 years, into the early 2000s, some even farther back. And demographically, we found that within these appointments, non-Hispanic whites were more likely to be seated. They were more likely to be these sort of legacy appointments, is how we've identified them. In fact, they make up over 57% of appointees with more than 4 years of experience. And so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into these longer term legacy appointments and the role that reappointments and undefined term limits might be playing in their retention. And so for reappointments, we found that 37 out of the 45 executive boards and commissions, which is just shy of over 347, had bylaws and statutes that outlined appointment terms and eligibility for reappointments. That's to say they have the ability to hold multiple terms in a position. With this group of appointments, we see that most appointees are actually within their first appointment, so about 67.5%. The remaining 32.5 have been reappointed at least once. And at face value, this doesn't seem like a large share, that 32.5%, but our data suggests that within reappointments, they really favor the retention of non-Hispanic whites, who make up 63.1% of these reappointments. Comparatively, Latinos only make up 7.8% of reappointments, and then these shares are pretty small for other races and get even smaller as you look at the number of reappointments, which ultimately for 4 or more are only white. Similarly, we found that 8 out of the 45 executive boards and commissions that we tracked had undefined term limits. And by undefined term limits, we mean that their boards and commission statutes do not have explicit reference to a cap on or a limit for how long an appointee serves. Instead, these folks serve at the leisure of the appointing authority. So non-Hispanic white commissioners make up a disproportionate share of these appointments at 52.4%, and then the next closest share is Latinos at 14.6%, and it just gets smaller from there. And ultimately, I point out reappointments and undefined term limits, not to say that they're inherently racially biased mechanisms or the roots of the inequity that we see in reappointments, but just to showcase how inadvertently they service and maintain the status quo of appointments that we currently see. There are, of course, many well-intentioned reasons for retaining expertise through reappointments, as well as maintaining governing sovereignty and independence through undefined term limits. But in practice, we've seen that they've made appointments a bit less reflective and less responsive to ever-changing democratic constituency that is our state. And so with that, I will pass it over to Paul to close us out with some conclusions and policy recommendations.
Thank you so much, Gabby. So as Gabby's thoughtfully outlined here today, our analysis at LPPI demonstrates that Latinos are and continue to be severely underrepresented in California's executive branch appointments, including senior leadership positions within the governor's cabinet and executive boards and commissions. So I'm going to invite our panelists to join us in a bit, but before we turn to Q&A, we wanted to share some of the policy recommendations that we believe the state could begin implementing immediately to improve equity and diversity in our state appointments process. So a frontline recommendation here, and you heard a bit about this earlier with our speakers, is a passage of California Senate Bill 1387, which has been authored by Senator Limon and is currently sitting on the governor's desk awaiting signature. As we've discussed, this bill would formalize an internal process within the governor's office to track and report the demographic makeup of gubernatorial appointments. As this report has showed us in the process of constructing and collecting the data, this type of demographic data tracking is incredibly labor intensive, which really makes a strong case for the necessity of having an internal mechanism for tracking within the governor's office rather than having to do the arduous steps of third-party verification. This data would be much easier to come by at the point of application and confirmation of candidates who are seeking these positions. A second recommendation here is encouraging of the governor to issue an executive order to set government-wide directives for reaching proportional representation and ensuring that appointments better reflect the state's diverse constituencies across race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, geographic residence, and more. And while we are legally prohibited as a state from establishing strict quotas, the governor could set guidelines around outreach and recruitment to help balance out diversity on these boards. The governor's appointments team should also review bylaws and statutes of executive boards and commissions in order to ensure that all of the appointments have appropriate, reasonable term limits and define conclusion of people's terms. Doing so, we believe, will create a more regular stream of openings on key boards and commissions where diverse candidates could then be recruited and appointed to these critical seats. And finally, the governor should also limit the practice of granting what we call legacy reappointments to boards and commissions, which the data has shown favors non-Hispanic white appointees over appointees of color. And instead, we can use these term limits and vacancies as opportunities to appoint candidates who better reflect California's diverse constituencies. So with that overview, we'd now love to turn it over to audience Q&A. We welcome any questions. There should be a chat feature available for folks to submit. And we're excited to be able to answer questions. Again, we have Senator Limon here, Diana from Hope, who's been a lead advocate and proponent for this legislation, and myself and Gabby to field any questions related to the report. So we'll give folks about a minute or two to start submitting questions over the chat function. And I think I see a few here. Great. So starting off with, yes, the slide deck will be made available. So we will try that. There's a comment from Patricia Sinai. Is there a recommendation for term limits on all boards? And if so, what length is recommended and why? So I'm wondering if maybe one of our policy experts here has any suggestions around what is good practice in term limits and whether or not that is reflected in the way that we currently conduct appointments. So either Diana, Senator Limon, Gabby, if you have thoughts on that, welcome your thoughts as well.
I would just briefly say that all boards and commissions kind of oversee and regulate very unique circumstances. So there isn't a set term that I would or could say as a best practice. I think more so when it comes to a lot of the folks who are serving at the leisure of an appointing authority, that gives more pause, I think, in terms of perpetuating a status quo. And then just maybe doing more due diligence around kind of interrogating when you're making a reappointment, whether this is a potential opportunity to broaden the voices that are currently sitting on a board and commission, and if not, why. I think I feel like more often than not, reappointments seem to be done a little bit more casually and maybe like setting a more clear rubric for when and why an reappointment is made. But not a set, I wouldn't say that there's a set term limit in mind that we've necessarily thought through.
And if I may add, I will just say, and Gabby kind of alluded to this, there's a lot of different boards and commissions at the state level, and certainly appointing to the Women's Commission or to a licensing commission for like nurses. I mean, they're very different, right, in terms of the work they do. So it's hard to have a one rule fits all. I think there's some where you really need a level of expertise, and institutional history is very helpful on being on that board of commission. And I think there's others where it really creates an opportunity for slightly more rotation if possible. So I think it depends. Most members, of the public in California don't actually know about these boards and commissions. And so that's really key, but some of them have more authority than others. Some serve in more of a capacity role, some serve in an oversight role, some serve as in a regulatory role. And so I think that matters as well.
Wonderful. We have a question here from Danielle Sue, who is interested in knowing whether the data includes individuals who identify as mixed, or does it include those who identify as only Latino and Latinas? Now I'll turn that over to Kathy.
Yeah, just briefly that we actually double counted folks who identified as more than one race. So let's say, for instance, if someone identified as Afro-Latino or Latina, then we counted them as both Black and Latino. There weren't many instances of that. I can only really think of a handful, but we didn't create a mixed race status specifically just because the counts were pretty low from what we could identify.
Thank you, Gabby. I have a question here for Hope. Why do Latinos and Latinas see a representational gap in appointments? What are some of the barriers they might encounter in seeking out or being confirmed for appointment?
Well, I think the senator alluded to this. A lot of people don't know that the boards and commissions are a thing, and so part of it is education. But I think the other part is, the intent of governors and appointing bodies to go out and search for folks to serve on these boards and commissions. So it's not just like a one issue reason why there is a gap. But I think the bill would specifically tackle one thing. The other part, the education part, I think is something that we've been working at for many years. But I think that, it's both of those things.
Thank you, Diana. Have a question here from Carlo. Hey, Carlo. Are most Latinx appointees middle class, college degree holding, or do they have working class roots experience, i.e., laborers, service providers, frontline workers? And I know there's some not to that in the data, but there's certainly more need to expand that level of data collection. But I'll turn it over to Gabby.
Yeah, I was actually going to throw an article in the chat. So we at LPPI have done a 15 facts about the well-being of Latinos in California specifically, where we've outlined a couple data points around educational attainment, median household income, labor force participation, and the like. Briefly, I can say that as of 2019, Latinos' income was lower than the state median average. It was about $58,000 for household incomes, which is about $330,000, I think, less than what California's median income was that year. They are less likely to have an associate's degree and higher than all other races. So I think broadly, just to speak, that there are a lot of economic disparities across race when it comes to Latinos. So I'm going to just share the document in the chat right now to kind of give everyone a little bit of a briefer overview on Latinos in California.
Thank you, Gabby. We have a question here from Patrick Salazar, who is interested in the concept of representational gap that was presented in the report. So if we say that Latinos should be participating on the commissions at the same rate of their population rate, aren't we potentially opening ourselves up to criticism around quota demands? Might we more effectively argue these commissions should be more accurately reflective of the public sector constituencies, i.e. voters, taxpayers? So I have some thoughts to share on that point, but I see Senator Limon sort of mulling the question over. Wanted to allow you a chance to jump in if you have thoughts on whether or not the aspiration should be proportional representation of the entire Latino community or just those that have either voting or tax-paying status.
I am of the mind that it should be, the aspiration should be to be reflective of our state of California. I think voters reflect one aspect of it, and certainly they have a voice and say when it comes to voting and the elections. However, as I mentioned, we have such a range of boards and commissions, from advisory roles to regulatory roles to oversight roles, and all of those matter in a really deep way to our community. So when you think about, for example, I'll give you one example, some of the debates that we've had with the Board of Education, and what types of elements or policies or curriculum should be in place for our students. And so having that wide array of thoughts and feedbacks and expertise has come in very helpful, because it's helped shape some policy and some of what we've outlined in the state through policy bills that come forward. I think right now you're looking, certainly you're looking at what it means to, right? We're looking at energy. We're talking a lot about energy in the last 24 hours and what it means to have folks from different parts of the state, where actually the temperature does vary, and our access to cooling centers varies, and our access to home retrofitting varies. All of these things matter, and people who represent different parts of our state have a different sense that they can bring to the table when we're making the statewide decisions and advising either the governor, the assembly, the Senate, or all three on certain policies. You see some legislation that is coming forward from the state legislature in 2022 that's very, very ambitious in meeting some of our climate goals. Well, it's going to be very important that we have representation from 58 different counties, from a lot of folks who will see and interpret those, how we achieve those climate goals in a very different way. We don't want to leave communities behind. And so that is why it's important to be able to do this. When you are a state that's the 5th largest economy in the world, that has 58 different counties, that has many ethnicities and races represented, you also want to make sure that our boards and commissions reflect that. So whether it's education, licensing of nurses, whether it's energy, whether it's climate goals, whether it's women, whether, the list just goes on boards and commission, fairgrounds, I mean, the list goes really on. You want to be able to have that. I've seen, for example, on the local level, boards and commissions that people don't maybe pay as much attention to, but that really are dealing with just how to use the space, that the state has. And so how you dictate how that space is used is by who's on that board of commission. And so I've seen very fascinating discussions as it relates to fairgrounds and fair boards. And so that is why this is all important. It can be from the macro level issues at the state level to really the local issues where only, it's so local that most of the state's not paying attention to who is on that board or commission, but we want that representation. And look, this is an issue on almost everything. I want to be very clear that while the state of California is moving this forward, we're advancing the conversation, it doesn't mean that the private industry or sector is also not in a place where they need to really think about representation. Certainly, that's why you've seen legislation move related to boards and commissions and the workplace, having more women, more people of color, right, on corporate boards. So we all have to be aware, but we also have to translate that awareness to action. And I think that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to push to get a little more action. And that action that we're pushing for with Senate Bill 1387 is not necessarily a determination of who will or will not be appointed, but it is an ask to get more data that is aggregated in a way that we can make better decisions, that we know where some of the openings are, we know where some of the holes are, and we as a community can then champion how we get more folks that reflect a broad array of thoughts, perspectives, lived experiences that would be helpful to that decision-making body.
Thank you, Senator. And just to add to that, we made a conscious decision to set our North Star as proportionality, in part because we don't believe it is an unreasonable thing to ask that the decision makers that promote decisions that are consequential for all California constituencies, that they be reflective of all California constituencies. And in fact, there's an argument to be made around the folks who are most directly impacted by policy and have the least ability to influence, thinking about children under the age of 18 who are not eligible for boards and commissions, thinking about non-citizens who are not able to vote for the governor or the Speaker of the Assembly who appoint the decision makers on these boards and commissions. These folks deserve to have their voice reflected, their issues and priorities represented at all levels of decision making, and we don't think that boards and commissions are an exception to that, certainly. We have a question here from Anabel Munoz from ABC7. Can you please share some examples of the real life impact in local communities as a result of underrepresentation of Latinos and diverse communities? Would love to maybe invite Diana to touch on that, and perhaps Senator, if you have other anecdotes or experiences to share.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's real life impact in all governing boards, whether it's oversight of a specific industry, right? It impacts people who are in that industry. But there's the larger the larger appointments. I think Patricia, if I'm correct, the Patricia Sinai who's here is someone who was appointed to a redistricting commission, and that has a lot of impact in all of our lives, right? How our districts are drawn throughout the state. Now SCA Administrator Isabel Guzman was formerly at the governor's office, and so that has a direct impact on small businesses she had direct impact on small businesses in California. And so they're having representation doesn't mean that they're only looking out for one constituency. It means that they're representing all Californians, right? And it's a different perspective. Personally, I was appointed to my first board when I was 24, and one of the first things that I noticed in that board was that it was to oversee for-profit colleges, and the vast majority of students that go to for-profit colleges are monolingual speakers. And so in the auditing process, all the materials were in English. And so how are people going to come forward and express that there's an issue at a school if they can't read the material that they're being presented to raise complaints? And so that's a very small impact, but it means a lot to the people who are impacted by, in that case, for-profit colleges. But you can see that at any level that the boards and commissions are overseeing, whether it's creating legislation or it's an oversight.
I see a question here from Ann Cervantes. A lot of our San Francisco friends have joined us today. Was there any tracking of the degrees from educational institutions to determine the availability to fill these commission seats? This is a similar requirement required of the business sector in tracking public dollars. So allow Gabby to touch on that question.
Yeah, so we did actually track for all of the appointments, alma maters, and educational attainment for all 400 plus, but we didn't actually break out that analysis for all of the appointments. We really spotlighted the educational appointments with the want to better understand how our various public and private institutions are being represented on these boards, since these folks often, these boards and commissions like the UC Regents that oversee education are dealing with quantifiable dollars that are then distributed to the student population. So with that though, when we looked at the educational attainment of folks who were on these boards and educational committees, we specifically saw that Community colleges in particular were severely underrepresented. There were only really a handful, like out of 83, I think it was only like 4 or 5 folks who actually had direct community college experience. Second, most underrepresented was our California State University, so CSUs. And then we saw a lot more, at least some kind of experience when it came to out of state and private schools in California. And broadly, because we were also interested in what that intersection looked like for Latinos in particular, we found that about 69% of Latinos on these boards and commissions had direct experience either in a public college or university system or that community college piece as well. So we didn't necessarily go into what educational attainment within those, like bachelor's degrees, associates and whatnot, but we do have some of that data, and perhaps that's something worth doing a refresh on to speak more to.
Thank you, Gabby. We have time for about 1 or 2 more questions, but before we close, I was going to invite our speakers here to share any next steps, action steps, call to actions that you believe would be really key opportunities for our audience to really become involved in this issue as a follow-up to this really important conversation that we're having. So we'll ask these 2 questions, and we'll turn it over to Dan and Senator Limon to maybe highlight some of those opportunities for our audience members. So we have a question here from Patrick Salazar. Aren't most of these appointments from the governor or their allies pool of campaign donors and election supporters? Should we be encouraging Latinos to be more active in these roles, positioning them for consideration? Any thoughts on the sort of early pipeline relationship building with some of these appointing entities? Either Dan or Senator Limon might be the offer any thoughts.
Well, I don't know if that was tracked in the report. And so I can't speak to whether that was tracked, and Gabby's already nodding her head no. However, I think we want to encourage participation from, Latinos, Latinas, women, all different groups in all different spaces. There's no doubt that that's important. And so as someone who actually started, I was appointed to the Santa Barbara County Commission for Women, right? And that was a county appointment, but nonetheless, it was an appointment. I understand the value of being involved and how, you start to create an awareness and engagement within the community that's slightly different. And so the more that we can do that, I think the better. So I can't necessarily speak directly to who is or is not appointed that could have been a supporter on what we call the non-state side. But certainly I do bring, an awareness and understanding that there's value in being involved all together in this process.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that. Our model here is that you should be involved in all aspects of democracy. So whether that's, volunteering on campaigns or in your local communities, certainly. We encourage you to do that, but getting an appointment to a board or commission shouldn't be contingent on that. I don't know that is. I didn't see that in the report. And so that's what HOPE does, right? Is leverage our network and our social capital to ensure that specifically Latinos, because we serve Latinas, are being considered for these appointments and for these boards. And we'll continue to do that work, but certainly everyone should be involved in, should be active participants in democracy.
Thank you both. I see a couple more questions that came in. So unfortunately, we may not be able to get all of them. So Gabby and I can drop in our emails here and welcome a conversation offline to be able to follow up on some of these remaining questions. But I think a good one to end on, we have a question from J.E.D. Ariasa. Does LPPI and other Latinx organizations expect to have meetings on the subject with candidates for governor or strongly advocate for this? So, we have every intention to make this, an issue that not only the incumbent, but also prospective candidates at really all levels of government take in earnest. We've had the opportunity to sit down with the governor's appointment secretary, Catherine Rivera Hernandez, who has been open to a discussion around how the report findings could really inform strategies around outreach, around building a meaningful pipeline that recruits Latinos and Latinas from all corners of the state and from all experiences and backgrounds, educational and working backgrounds. And so we invite members of the audience here to continue following the work of LPPI. Our research on our social media accounts will certainly be presenting some of these opportunities on how you all can continue to be involved in really pushing our senior leaders from the governor's office down to our school board members who also do local appointments and everywhere in between. So we're really excited to see what unfolds as a follow-up to this report. And we are committed at LPPI to continue this representational research. We have an intention to have sort of a refresh of this report to allow us to continue to have this type of information and data until and when eventually, hopefully, the governor's administration agrees to support in some of this internal tracking. But we see the need for this data. We see a tremendous void, and we're committed at LPPI to continue to provide this information and resource to not only our legislators and partners, but also to you all who are leaders and organizers on the ground who are pushing to have your voice reflected in all decision making. So wanted to close out here with turning it over again to Diana and Senator Limon for any closing remarks and specifically calls to action, links to resources, campaigns that folks in the audience here could become engaged with, and we'll be dropping in some of this information in the chat. So please make sure to refer to those links.
Yeah, I'll let the senator have the last word. I just wanted to share, Hope is, very much committed to this work. The bill is at the final stage. We're doing a push within our base to urge the governor to sign it. We have an email letter writing campaign. I think the link was dropped, I don't have the ability to drop links to everyone, so if someone can drop it, that'd be great. But we are asking folks to do an email letter writing campaign urging the governor to sign it. And of course, if you want to tweet him, you're more than welcome to do that. We're hopeful.
And I'm going to echo Diana's comments in saying that our real clear immediate ask is to do everything we can as a community to support Senate Bill 1387. So whether it's social media, tweeting, any other forms, or emailing the governor. So I know that you can email the governor's office at leg.unit.gov.ca.gov. Again, that's leg.unit at gov.ca.gov. So that is our ask. You have all the links here that we've added, but in the short term, we really want access to data. I think once we have access to real-time data aggregated in a way that helps us inform our own thinking about this process, we can then think about next steps. But right away, it's supporting Senate Bill 1387.
Thank you so much, Senator. And the last resource I dropped here, of course, is you all, right? The human capital and talent that exists up and down the state of California. We can begin to change our numbers by having you all pursue these positions, these open vacancies on critical decision-making boards. And so we certainly encourage you to look up the rosters of vacancies, of opportunities for us to influence policymaking from a Latino lens. And I shared in as another call to action, a link where you can look at what those openings are, what the process is to learn about, who are the individuals that you might need to speak with, and what type of information you would need to prepare to be considered for these roles. And again, we are here to support you in that process. We need more diverse representation that really reflects the numerosity and also the color and the value of the Latino community and what we generate for California. So with that, we thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a wonderful conversation. A tremendous gratitude to Diana, the team at Hope, Senator Limon for being such a staunch and unwavering champion on this issue. We look forward to continuing to partner with your office. Thank you so much to Gabby Carmona for her powerful intellect and really crafting and developing the vision for this report. And we're excited to continue to provide more products that are helpful and empowering of our community and really speak to these issues of representation and democratic inclusion. So thank you all again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Bye, everyone.